Your mother, in her book, Peace Be to Her Ashes, she states that she sensed that your father was a lonely man, that his officials, in his absence, they would gather on the fourth floor and discuss all kinds of things about him, talk about impeaching him, and there were times when we even learned that there were attempts by people within his ranks to overthrow him by force. So, against this backdrop, would you say that you said that some group of socialists that were responsible for your father's death, but against the backdrop of your mother's revelation, that even his own officials were not supporting him, and she even mentioned to him, according to what she's reading in her book, that he was like a lonely tree in the forest. So how can you reconcile all what was going on, attempts by his officials to undo him, as opposed to what you describe as plan by a socialist to get rid of him?
Well, I never said that is the socialist group responsible for my father's death. I said clearly they had a big part to play on the destruction in Liberia, and they have to acknowledge that, because they sowed a seed of hatred, and I repeat that again. They sowed a seed of hatred in Liberia that would be very difficult to get out, because their truth is not really the truth. They were the one that encouraged all this killing in Liberia. Though they didn't even know some of the people he killed. They identified the people. They had one of them go to Crosserville to identify where I was. There were people, I had to hide in the bush because people were there checking in the different houses, shooting doors down where I went. Where I used to help, my husband and I used to carry rice to people. So I didn't say that they were responsible for my father's death. My father was killed by a masked man. My mother couldn't see who killed him, but they were responsible for some of the agitation and disruption in the community in Liberia. We cannot, that's my feeling. If it's my perception, that's how I felt. But now that my father was lonesome, I did say that my father was a person who wanted a lot of changes. People ridiculed him for wearing the sweatsuit. But he wore it, he told me, it was important to decrease the gap, economic gap. Why shouldn't everybody else be present at the table for discussion? And it helped. I know it helped, because I saw people going to functions that didn't normally go. So there were things he was doing that was disturbing to some of his so-called inner circle. And another thing my father knew about the PRO in Liberia. He dismantled that. Some people were getting the income from that. So some people were disturbed about that. Maybe if not themselves, their relatives were getting income. It was a profession in Liberia, which he felt wasn't necessary. And when my mother said he was lonesome, it's because my father, people would come and tell him stories, and he would literally ask the person, he would call the person and the next person to tell him, can you tell me what you said about this person? And the reason he did that is because for 19 years, he saw that happening. He saw people getting in trouble. He saw people going to prison. He saw people disappearing, and he didn't want to be part of that. That's why I knew my father did not sign any execution order for Barkas Matthew or those people. He forgave them before the coup took place. So the fact that my mother felt he was lonesome, my father was never a person to have, he wasn't a smoker, he didn't used to drink. So he didn't have buddies that would come and sit down and drink. He was busy about his business. He used to stay up nights preparing for what he needed to do. He was serious about development. So some people were not. Some people were used to the relax. So do you think they would be jumping? Of course, for them too. Sometimes that change was a bit too rapid. So I think that's why. He and I never discussed it. But I too, when I went to talk to my father about his death, he looked sad and lonesome. You are lonesome when he knew his death was imminent. He built his grave. His own grave he built. He had his own casket. I think he gave it to Green when he died. But he was getting his own casket. But it was useless anyway. Because he said he wanted to be buried within 2 to 3 days after his death. So he was different. He was different than many people in Liberia. That's why he was lonesome.
Now, as a student leader in the 70s, I interacted on quite a number of occasions with your father. And I remember specifically in 1979, following the arrest riots, were then detained. When the late Albert Port came to visit and said that he had received information that your father was about to appoint Mr. Chesson as Minister of Justice, and he had warned him against it, and he didn't feel that it would have augured well, that he would have propelled him in the wrong direction, and would have created a crisis in the country. Mm-hmm. And in one of his writings, Support states that he did go to the president, interceded with him, not to go ahead with the appointment, but he still did anyway. And we saw how he conducted himself, mass arrests during his tenure, all of this culminating right there about before the coup. So I won't understand why this situation was so, and perhaps you were not because he was so far away from politics. But there was concern that your father was incapable of restraining the excesses of his family members, particularly his younger brother, Steve, who was Minister of Finance. What could you say to that?
The excesses? What do you mean by excesses?
Like, for instance, there was the case involving, there was an article written by Liberianization of Goblin Business, in which there was a feud between your uncle and the Weeks concerning monopoly over, well, it had to do with monopoly. He said Liberianization of Goblin Business. They accused him of using his official position to create a monopoly to his benefit. And that's basically what I'm talking about.
Well, I don't know anything about that, so I'm sorry I have to pass. I don't know about that, but...
And then lastly...
everybody knows that Stephen Tauber he died in a plane crash. We don't know how, why, and whether there was a foul play. But he died 5 years before the coup. So he was not around the coup time. He was a strong businessman, a man that, like every businessman, of course, he was seeking his own interests a lot. But he didn't affect my father. He has his own private business,
Lastly, right before the coup in 1980, there was a Congress of the Truic Party, Buchanan, in which there were many young Liberians at the time, Emmanuel Shaw and others, who were agitating for change in the Truic Party, and I expected that the Buchanan Congress would have delivered on the kind of changes that they were expecting. And according to them, to their surprise, this was not the case. That rather than change, the Buchanan Congress produced basically the same kind of leadership and moved in the same direction. So don't you think this could have contributed to what eventually led to the coup?
I don't know about that particular conference, but I know, well, I don't really think that what led to the coup. But, you know, I know that before the coup, when President Talbot had organized so many groups to discuss development, to discuss, they had different focus groups, different task forces about development. And I myself, after the Rice Riot, for the first time I decided, oh, I should be engaged in order to dispel some of the myths about my father. And so that was the first time I started learning about some of these different parties. And my father encouraged freedom of speech. He encouraged multi-parties. PAL and Moja, everybody know those groups. He encouraged them. He sent, Vice President Warner talked about him giving these boys some of his own private money, gave them cars to go in the rural area and see his development. So I don't see what more he could have done.